Look at this map. This is a mathematical impossibility. In 1981, Saddam Hussein was months away from fueling the Osirak nuclear reactor. Once radioactive material was placed inside the dome, bombing it would create a catastrophic nuclear fallout over Baghdad. Israel had a closing window of just a few weeks to destroy the reactor before it went online. To do it, they needed to fly 1,000 miles across hostile Saudi and Jordanian airspace, drop 4,000 pounds of high explosives directly onto a reinforced concrete dome, and fly 1,000 miles back. But they had a massive engineering problem. The only jet they had capable of dodging Iraqi air defenses was the brand-new American F-16 Fighting Falcon, and the F-16 was a short-range dogfighter. It was physically, mathematically, and aerodynamically incapable of flying 2,000 miles round-trip with a heavy payload. If they flew the mission according to the manufacturer's specifications, the jets would run completely out of fuel deep inside Iraqi territory. Every single pilot would crash or be captured. To survive, Israeli engineers and pilots had to hack the physics of their own aircraft. They had to break every rule in the American flight manual, push the jet's landing gear to the verge of catastrophic collapse, and invent a refueling tactic so dangerous it was universally banned. This is the story of Operation Opera, how 8 F-16s manipulated aerodynamics, bypassed their structural weight limits, and executed the most audacious, physics-defying airstrike of the 20th century. To understand why this mission was considered a suicide run, you have to understand how the F-16 was engineered. When the fighter mafia inside the US Pentagon designed the F-16 in the 1970s, they wanted the exact opposite of a heavy bomber. They wanted a lightweight, hyper-lethal dogfighter. They stripped away every ounce of excess weight, and that meant stripping away fuel capacity. The F-16 was designed to take off, rapidly climb to 30,000 feet, shoot down Soviet MiGs over Europe, and land 45 minutes later. Its power plant, the Pratt & Whitney F-100 turbofan engine, produced a staggering 23,000 pounds of thrust, but it guzzled jet fuel at a terrifying rate. The internal tanks of the F-16 hold roughly 7,000 pounds of usable jet fuel. The math was brutal. A 2,000-mile round trip at low altitudes where the air is thick and engines burn fuel faster required significantly more fuel than the jet could carry. They could add external drop tanks under the wings, but that created a paradox. When you bolt massive fuel tanks and 2,000-pound iron bombs to the wings of an F-16, you dramatically increase its weight and its aerodynamic drag. Drag is the enemy of fuel efficiency. The heavier and bulkier the jet, the harder the engine has to work to push it through the air. The harder the engine works, the faster it drains the very fuel you just added. It is a vicious cycle. The Israeli mission planners ran the simulations over and over again, and every single time the computer said the jets would hit bingo fuel, the point of no return, before they even reached the target. They needed a hack, and that hack started on the runway. If you can't change the size of the fuel tanks, you have to change how you fill them. When a fighter jet starts its engine and taxis from the hangar to the edge of the runway, it burns hundreds of pounds of fuel. Before the F-16s even took off for Iraq, they would already be mathematically doomed. So the Israelis authorized a procedure known as hot pit refueling.
Normally, fueling a jet is done with the engine completely shut off. Jet fuel is highly volatile, and a running engine creates massive heat and static electricity. Pumping highly pressurized fuel into a running aircraft is a massive fire hazard. But the Israelis had no choice. The pilots started their engines, ran all their pre-flight checks, and taxied to the very edge of the runway. While the massive F-100 engines were screaming at idle, ground crews rushed out and plugged the hoses directly into the jets. They topped the tanks off to the absolute maximum limit right as the planes were cleared for takeoff. They didn't lose a single drop of fuel to taxiing. But this created a terrifying structural crisis. The F-16s were carrying two 2,000-pound Mk-84 unguided bombs, two AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles, and three massive external fuel tanks. The jets were overloaded. They weighed over 35,000 pounds. They were so heavy that the landing gear struts were completely compressed, and the rubber tires were bulging dangerously close to their bursting point. If a tire blew at 150 miles per hour during takeoff, the jet, heavily laden with high explosives and jet fuel, would instantly detonate on the runway. The pilots had to pull the stick back with everything they had, just to rip the heavy, unaerodynamic machines off the concrete. They were in the air, but now they had to navigate the deadliest aerodynamic environment possible, the deck. To avoid the overlapping radar networks of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq, the strike package could not fly at 30,000 feet, where fuel efficiency is highest. They had to fly at 100 feet, on the deck. Flying a jet at 100 feet above the ground is an incredibly aerodynamic nightmare. The air at sea level is incredibly dense. Pushing a heavily loaded fighter jet through dense air at 500 miles per hour is like trying to run waist deep in a swimming pool. The parasitic drag on the airframe was immense. The engines were screaming, burning fuel at an astronomical rate just to maintain speed. To mitigate this, the pilots had to fly in a perfect, rigid formation. They used the aerodynamic wake of the lead jets to slightly reduce the drag on the trailing aircraft, like race cars drafting on a track. But the fuel was still draining too fast. Every F-16 carried two 370-gallon drop tanks under the wings. Standard procedure dictated that you wait until the tanks are completely empty before you jettison them. But the Israelis ran the math. They realized that the physical drag created by the massive empty space inside the tanks was costing them more energy than the remaining fuel was providing. So, while still deep over the Saudi desert, the pilots prematurely ejected their drop tanks. They threw away perfectly good fuel to instantly shed thousands of pounds of drag and weight, instantly streamlining the aircraft. It was a desperate gamble. If their math was wrong by even a few percentage points, they would be gliding into the Iraqi desert without power. Suddenly, the massive dome of the Osirak reactor appeared on the horizon. After 600 miles of flying at 100 feet, the strike package hit the target area. Because they had to fly so low, they couldn't just drop the bombs. An unguided 2,000-pound bomb needs altitude to arm itself and build enough kinetic energy to smash through a reinforced concrete dome. The pilots executed a violent pop-up maneuver. They slammed the throttles into full afterburner, burning catastrophic amounts of their precious remaining fuel, and shot up to 8,000 feet. At the apex, they rolled the jets inverted, pulled the nose down, and entered a 35-degree dive directly into the teeth of Iraqi anti-aircraft fire. They had no laser-guided smart bombs. They relied on analog, CCIP, continuously computed impact point, and their own raw physical skill. Within exactly 80 seconds, 16 2,000-pound Mk-84 bombs smashed through the dome of the Osirak reactor. The sheer kinetic force of the tungsten-hardened steel casings shattered the concrete, and the delayed fuses detonated the explosives deep inside the core. The facility was completely vaporized. But the mission wasn't over. They still had to get home. The pilots climbed to high altitude. They pulled the throttles back to the absolute bare minimum, entering a desperate, agonizing glide across the Middle East. They were running on fumes. When the strike package finally touched down on the runway in Israel, the fuel gauges in several of the jets read essentially zero. They had hacked the math perfectly. Before June 1981, the world viewed the F-16 as a short-range defensive interceptor. It was a sports car built for dogfights. But Operation Opera changed aerospace history forever. By hacking the weight limits, ignoring the fuel tables, and breaking every aerodynamic rule in the flight manual, Israel proved that the F-16 could operate as a devastating long-range strategic bomber. It was a masterpiece of desperate engineering and logistical brilliance. So here's my question for you. Was Operation Opera the greatest display of raw piloting skill in modern history, or was it purely a triumph of mathematical planning? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to know how Israeli engineers built a $2 laser to shoot down drones, breaking the economics of modern warfare, you need to click this video right here. Hit subscribe. We are just getting started.